Well, I'm excited now to shift back to the U.S., and I've got the privilege of welcoming Andy Crouch. Andy is a partner for theology and culture at Praxis, which is an organization that works as a creative engine for redemptive entrepreneurship. We'll talk more about that. He is an author. He serves on the governing board of Fuller Theological Seminary and the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. He also serves as an advisor to the Repentance Project. There are so many things I don't have time to get to them all because he has such great information to share with us. And Andy, welcome to the Global Church Forum. It's great to have you here with us. And we're going to give you about 25 minutes. I know you're going to share with us what's on your heart today, and we're excited about that. And then let me just tell you ahead of time that we're going to have a time of Q&A at the end of this. So if you have any questions throughout or toward the end, just send those through in the chat. Let us know about it, and I'll be sure to get to as many of those questions as we can. Andy, again, welcome to the Global Church Forum. The floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Colin. It is great to see you, and I look forward to talking with you and others after I share a few ideas that have become pretty meaningful to me and have become meaningful to our team at Praxis. And I think they are going to dovetail well with so much of what's been said and shared in the last 24 hours. I have not caught all of it, but I have heard several of the other speakers, and it has struck me that some of the basic dynamics that I want to describe to you now play out in the stories of Doug Eubank and Free Burma Rangers and Paulo and his work in Brazil, and in the kind of choices and kind of rapid adjustments that Alpha has had to make. So I will share some images with you to just track as we go through this material, because it really is built on a super simple observation, which is that all of us are doing something in the world. We're doing it in a certain way, and we're doing it for a certain reason. We're doing the what of what we're doing matters, the how of what we're doing matters, and the why matters. And I want to present a framework that will lead us to the core question of what is redemptive action in the world. And will maybe illuminate a central theme of Scripture in a way that applies more broadly than I think we have sometimes realized. I think that when we think about the responsibility of Christians in the world, our vision can sometimes get too narrow when in fact it needs to be incredibly comprehensive. And this is a very comprehensive picture of what we face as we go out into the world and try to serve God and other people, and also how we can be potentially kind of maximum effect for God's purposes. So it begins with a simple observation, which is that the default way of the world is exploitative, exploitation, marked by taking all you can get, winning at any costs. Often the sort of implicit assumption here is that any transaction will be a win-lose transaction, and the goal is for me to win and for you to lose. And so much of what we experience as we come of age, as we really take stock of the systems we're part of the opportunities that are before us, we start to feel like we live in an exploitative world, because we do. And the rules of this world, when it comes to what we do, is that we toil. The world is marked by toil in the human experience. And why would you toil? Why would you work really hard, sometimes without a lot of evident fruit or any sense of abundance? Well, you toil for the rewards that are available. Sometimes it's just to feed your family. Sometimes it's to achieve a certain kind of status, a recognition in the competition for a place in the world. But it feels like toil, and what you do feels like toil. And how do we do that? How do we kind of make our way when we are kind of operating in an exploitive system? It's through striving for control. And we learn in direct and indirect ways, sometimes at very early ages, that we've got to strive, we've got to put a lot of effort into getting into a situation where we can control the outcome. And you even look at children playing together, and at least in my culture, boys and girls do this a little bit differently, but each has their way of striving for control, because we learn as soon as we start interacting with other people, maybe especially once we get outside the bonds of love and family, if our family has been relatively healthy, we realize I've got to get an edge here. And we come to believe that the why behind our lives, the kind of deep narrative of our lives, is that we're going to win through strength. I think if we're honest, this takes up a lot of attention, energy, effort, in a way, belief in the world around us. Many, many people around us are living fundamentally out of this set of approaches. And we often feel a kind of compulsion, a kind of coercive quality to this, that you've got to live this way if you're going to live at all. Probably billions of human beings look at the world, and this is pretty much what they see. And of course, there's a whole Christian account of how we got to this place, but there's another layer that I want to get to, which is that very early in the human story, in a way, and right alongside the exploitative, comes the quest for the ethical. And there begins to be this dream. I'm thinking even way back in kind of the civilizational history of human beings, going back to the Code of Hammurabi, the ancient king in Mesopotamia, one of the first to enact a kind of set of laws that would set out the obligations of a ruler towards his subjects and the obligations of subjects toward one another. There's this beginning of an articulation of an ethical way in which there's a right way to do things, and we aim to do things right. And that if we were to live according to this set of law and principles, I would win and you would win, that there would actually be mutual benefit, mutual genuine advantage. And it's rooted in a belief that there's a way to not just toil for rewards, but produce for results, to actually put our efforts together to create something that actually has beneficial outcomes in the world. And over time, maybe not quite at the time of Hammurabi, but by the time we get to our modern version of this, the how is put sometimes in terms like this: we serve with excellence. We are no longer just striving, but we're actually out to help one another and to do that in an excellent way. And why? Because the narrative has become that we succeed through character, that if you are a good person, if you develop your skills and your competence and also your trustworthiness and your willingness to play by the rules, that you'll succeed. This is also a powerful narrative in our world. Our families try to instill this in us. Our communities, often our schooling, often our workplaces try to instill this in us. And actually, I think if you kind of imagine a vision statement on the wall of all kinds of corporations, small and large, local businesses, multinationals, they might well have something like this literally on their wall. What do we do at First Megacorp? We produce for results. We serve with excellence. We succeed through character. And this ethical way is a huge improvement over the exploitative. And I think almost every human being tries to tell their story in this way. Now, the Christian insight is that as much as we try to live this way, the exploitative is always not just out there, not just the province of bad people, though there are bad people, but the bad people actually include us. The exploitative is not just out there, it's in here. And the further Christian insight is that the ethical way somehow falls short. The people of Israel were given this incredible set of principles, 637 mitzvot, as the rabbis counted them, 637 principles by which to live, in which they would be a supremely ethical people in the midst of an exploitative context in the ancient Near East, or an incipiently ethical, but not fully ethical context. And yet when Jesus from Nazareth arrives, and they are in a way trying to live some version of this script, he critiques their way of life. He says, you are actually just following the letter of the law. You are cleansing the outside of the cup, because the ethical way actually can be associated with legalism. It can be associated with pride. And so there seems to be this sort of fundamental question raised by the life of Jesus, but also maybe raised by our own circumstances. Isn't ethical enough? And it seems like the answer is ethical isn't enough. I want to unpack that a little bit, because I think that that to an extent, a lot of Christians believe, especially when they leave their Sunday environment, their church environment, and go into their work environment, that ethical is enough. That what I need to do when I'm out in the world is be a good person, and maybe church and my Christian experience helped me to be a good person. But I think there's a deeper pattern, a pattern beyond ethical that actually matters a lot. And here is how I would put it. Ethical isn't enough when exploitation is winning. Ethical isn't enough in a world where exploitation often actually carries the day. Many of us, especially as we've listened over the last 24 hours to the global realities that we are embedded in, we live more or less proximate to environments where exploitation is absolutely winning. Right alongside the very inspiring stories from Dave Eubank and the Free Burma Rangers, the incredible heroic acts of love and sacrifice, is the consciousness that this civil war has been going on through the whole story of Dave's and his family's and his partner's work. And the truth is, when you read the news about Myanmar, Burma, or Syria, or Iraq, most days you feel like exploitation is winning. And I want to suggest that when exploitation is winning, ethical action is not sufficient, because it cannot repair the damage exploitation is doing or has done. When exploitation is winning, people are losing by definition. The victims of exploitation are people. Now, it's not actually the only victims. The natural world, the created world, which human beings were given to tend and care for in ways that led to flourishing, also suffers. But the very heart of the horror of exploitation is that people lose their image-bearing capacity. And that is why creation itself groans, because when human beings are fully image bearers of God, creation will flourish. But when people are losing their image bearing capacity, everything around them is degraded and suffers. And when exploitation has won, when it has carried the day in a situation and people just conclude this is the way the world is, we are left with the damage of war, we are left with the damage of corruption. People have lost. People are stuck. People often have no way to extricate themselves. And when exploitation is won and people have lost, redemptive action can restore. And this brings us to something beyond the ethical. If I am ethical right here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I live, and I happen to be in a relatively ethical system, one governed by the rule of law, one in which people do try to succeed through character and serve with excellence and produce for results, that's well and good. But just down the road from me, let alone a short plane flight away from me, are situations, places, systems, groups of people who have lost to exploitation. And my being ethical where I am does very little or nothing to offer any kind of restoration to all that has been lost through the march of exploitation, through so much of history and so much of the human story. But redemptive action is something beyond the ethical that actually can bring restoration even in the most brutal and damaged context, the places where you think nothing good can come from this place. In fact, there is a way for restoration to happen. So let's just think about what that looks like. And let's think about it for a few moments in light of the biblical story that I think if you had asked a first century Jew, if you had asked one of Jesus' disciples, or if you had asked one of the Pharisees, or if you had asked Jesus himself, tell me a story of redemptive action from your scriptures. Tell me a story of redemption. Now, this is before Jesus has sort of brought about the supreme redemption of the human race through the cross and the resurrection. So before that happens, and you say, tell me a story of redemption, what story would they have told you? And I'm almost certain I know the answer. I think they would have told you a story that begins with these words: in the days when the judges ruled. This story is told right at the end of the biblical book of Judges. As you know, the biblical book of Judges recounts a kind of series of attempts to set up a reasonable ethical kind of norm in Israel, and it just fails over and over because the judges in the end are not able to sustain the kind of obedient, faithful, communal life that Israel was called to. It's a story of very unstable equilibriums, broken again and again by violence, sometimes rescued by these heroic figures, Deborah and Samson and so forth, but mostly a time of great chaos. And the book of Judges ends with really perhaps the most horrific story in the Hebrew scriptures, in which a concubine and her common law husband are traveling. They cannot find hospitality. There is a brutal all-night sexual assault that ends in the death of the woman. And in response, her husband, the Levite, we only know him that way, cuts up her body and sends the 12 pieces to the 12 tribes of Israel and says, are we going to tolerate this kind of violence and violation in our land? It leads to a horrible civil war, which then leads to acts of further sexual assault, rape, and violence. It's absolutely horrible. And that's the end of the book of Judges. It ends, as you know, in those days, there was no king in Israel. There's no ethical system in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And in those days, there is a couple from the town of Bethlehem. And this is, of course, the beginning of the book of Ruth. You will probably know the story, and I don't have time to retell it, but it is such a powerful story, sometimes reduced to just a little charming romance. It is so much more than that. I want to just try to briefly give you a picture of all the elements of redemptive action that we glimpse in the book of Ruth. The sort of setup, as you know, is that Elimelech, the man from Bethlehem, his wife Naomi encounter a famine. So civil disorder is compounded by natural disaster. And how many probably hundreds of millions of people today are literally living in this situation all over the world. They have to emigrate. They become immigrants in the land of Moab. They have two sons, and the sons marry Moabite women. And so now we have cross-cultural marriages, probably multilingual marriages, all the potential challenges of that. And then a further set of tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies, but then both of the sons die as well. And Naomi is left with her two daughters-in-law. In the end, Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem. And this is not a easy decision for many reasons. But maybe the most poignant reason and the most alarming reason that it is dangerous for Naomi, a widow, to go back to Bethlehem, perhaps with one or both of her daughters-in-law, is that Bethlehem is not O Little Town of Bethlehem, the Christmas carol we love to sing in the English-speaking world at this time. Because the name of the concubine, the way we identify the concubine in the book of Judges, who is brutally assaulted and murdered, and whose murder leads to civil war, she is known in the Judges text only to us, not by her proper name, but by where she came from. And where she comes from is Bethlehem. She's called the Bethlehemite. For a widow and two young widows of their own right, who are also going to be immigrants, to go to Bethlehem is an absolute last resort, because Bethlehem is a byword for everything that can go wrong and for all the vulnerabilities you can face as a woman, as a widow, as an unprotected immigrant in a very, very violent and brutal land. And so on the journey, Naomi actually pleads with her daughters-in-law to turn back, to go back to their own country. She will go on her own to Bethlehem. And of course, this is the first kind of inciting moment of the story. Orpah, one daughter-in-law, kisses her mother-in-law. And I think this is very significant because Orpah, through the whole brief time we see her in the story, is fully, deeply ethical. She has shown great loyalty to her mother-in-law. She clearly loves her mother-in-law. If you know anything about daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law, this is actually quite wonderful, how warm their relationship is. And she's weeping as she takes her leave, but she does what everyone in that world would agree was a perfectly ethical thing. Ruth, however, in spite of Naomi's pleadings, gives this beautiful speech and song and says, wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And Ruth steps beyond the ethical requirements of her relationship and accompanies her mother-in-law, Naomi, to Bethlehem. It's beautiful, but it's also tragic. When Naomi arrives, she says to the women who recognize her, don't call me Naomi anymore, a word that means sweet. Call me Mara, a word that means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. They are in trouble. They can only blame God. They do not know what will happen, except that there is an ethical practice in the land, at least in some fields, which is the practice of gleaning. And one of their relatives, Boaz, a rich landowner, has preserved, in the midst of the lawlessness of his world, he's preserved this ethical obligation of agricultural landowners to allow the poor and the immigrants, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger to come glean in the field. And so Ruth goes to glean in Boaz's field. So this, I think, is an important moment to pause and say that ethical is very important. It is so important that Boaz, probably unlike some other landowners, we know that this was not universally practiced. We know that people were often greedy and exploitative, but this ethical practice of gleaning had been preserved in Boaz's field. And in fact, it's also clear that Boaz has preserved norms for how vulnerable women are to be treated in the field. He says to Ruth when she arrives to glean, I've instructed the young men not to bother you. He has established kind of ethics of protection. And the ethical is an incredible baseline for human flourishing. But something has to happen beyond the ethical for Naomi and perhaps also for Ruth to be restored. And so, without going into all the details, it's a great kind of soap opera. It's very, very fun to read. It's kind of funny to read in some ways. And then there's this kind of amazing scene on the threshing floor where Ruth goes late at night, middle of the night, not even recognizable, lies down at Boaz's feet and uncovers his feet, the text says. But the Hebrew often uses feet as a euphemism for the unpresentable parts of the body. And it's very possible that, in fact, what she does is she just throws off his robe so that he awakens unclothed, open and vulnerable to the world. And then she says something very remarkable to him, spread your cloak over your servant. And I think that what she is doing here is inviting Boaz through this sudden, unexpected exposure, this sudden vulnerable situation. I think she's in a way saying, this is what it feels like to be me. This is what it feels like to be my mother-in-law, Naomi. This is what it feels like to be at the mercy of an exploitive world. Would you spread your cloak over your servant? She's asking him to step in and play the role of what was literally called in the Hebrew scriptures, a redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, the next of kin, who would step in and buy the land and care for the family after a man, the patriarch of the family, had unexpectedly died. And it's at this moment that something very interesting is revealed. There's actually a next of kin who's closer. There's another kinsman closer than I, Boaz says. This is the person in this system who has the actual ethical responsibility to take on the role of the kinsman redeemer. But Boaz says, I'm going to go to the gate of the city tomorrow where business is transacted and deals are done. And we read between the lines, I'm going to find a way to persuade him that he will give up his ethical duty and I'll step in. And that's exactly what happens. The next of kin actually doesn't want to do the right thing because it will mean giving up his own line, taking on the line of Elimelech. It will mean marrying an immigrant, a foreigner. And Boaz, out of his great love for Ruth and in great admiration of her love for her mother-in-law, plays this role. They marry. And why is this story told? Well, because this is part of the hinge of the history of Israel, because their son is named Obed. Obed's son is named Jesse, and Jesse's son is named David of Bethlehem. And the women say to Ruth and Boaz, "Blessed be the Lord." And they say to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord." Naomi, who once said, "The Lord has dealt bitterly with me, has dealt harshly with me," now is caught up in blessing because a redeemer acted. And there's an interesting question here. Who's the redeemer in the book of Ruth? The odd answer is that actually the redeemer, we don't know his name, but we know who he is. He's the next of kin who ethically is supposed to step in and take care of the situation. But because he sort of opts out, we actually have in this book two people who did not have to redeem, who instead voluntarily, sacrificially act as redeemers. And the first is Ruth, in her decision not to do the ethical thing and go back, but do the redemptive thing and go forward, taking on the full weight of identifying with Naomi and all of her suffering, and also in her God and his goodness. And then Boaz, who doesn't have to redeem, but does. Redemptive action is creative. It creates a new set of possibilities where it looks like there are no possibilities. It's restorative. It actually rescues and brings back possibility that everyone thought had been lost. And it absolutely costs. It requires sacrifice. And so actually at Praxis, when we talk about this, we talk about redemptive action as creative restoration through sacrifice. The redemptive way is not built on lose-win or win-lose kind of thinking. It's not even built on win-win thinking. Creative restoration through sacrifice says, I will sacrifice, but then we will win. Rather than us engaging in just some arm's length transaction, whether exploitative or mutually beneficial, I am going to step in where it looks like there's just a lot of damage and danger. And then through that, it is going to create a new we. I think about the naming of the sons. Dave Eubank described this, that his son is named after this medic he met in the jungle. The medic's son is named after Dave. And this intertwining of families and generations and mission, it creates a new we, and we win together. So what is our mission in the world? To create through restoration. This is what we are trying to do. Creatively step into the world for the restoration of what's been damaged by exploitation. How are we going to do that? Our vision of how we do it is we bless and love. And why? Because we have learned that the deep story of our lives is that we sacrifice through grace. Let's talk, Colin, let's you and I talk for a few minutes about what this means, and maybe others will have questions, but I think this is maybe a way to sum up so much of what's been said, and gives us maybe a different vision of how deep the transformation of our lives and the mission of God in the world is meant to be.
Yeah, I love what a great story to share right at the end, to give us a picture in Scripture of what this really looks like, and as you step through the story, just to be able to see each piece of that. I love that. I want to take just a moment, talk about that redemptive word. You mentioned it, and you mentioned the Redeemer in the story. There might be some who say, wait, Christ is the only Redeemer. What's our part? How does redemption come into play with us individually?
Yes. We've come to think of redemption as a kind of theological word, or maybe more specifically soteriological word. It refers to the act of salvation. But we have to remember that redemption was a metaphor that was adopted by the first Christians as they reflected what Jesus had done. But they adopted it from the social economic world that they lived in. And it's still an economic word, even in our world. So in the world of finance, a bond is redeemed. And what does it mean to redeem a bond? It doesn't mean to bring salvation to the bond or the bondholder or the bond issuer. It simply means that someone pays back the principal on a debt, and the debt is now canceled. So redemption is liberating something from bondage, you could say, by paying a price. And so the first Christians, as they were reflecting on Jesus, first they thought, oh, he is like a kinsman redeemer. He's like this figure from the law. But he didn't have to step in. We had alienated ourselves from him. He had no ethical obligation to save us in our own damaging of the world. But just like Boaz, just like Ruth, he kind of voluntarily stepped into the mess, came to the dangerous place, went to the worst place you could imagine, the garbage dump of the city, suffered the worst fate. But now, by paying that price, has set us free from the debt that we all owed, and then the slavery we were all in to sin. So it's an unbelievably powerful metaphor for what Christ has done for us. But it is at first a metaphor. That is, it takes this other thing from the world that already existed and that still exists in our time, and just says the ultimate example of this is Jesus. Now, Jesus' act on the cross, nothing else could liberate us from the bondage of sin, the wages of sin, which are death. There's nothing we can do that compares to that. So one way we put it in practice is redemption is the way God saves the world. But does that mean that we can't apply it to our own action? I think quite the reverse. It becomes the pattern for our lives, not to save the world, but to serve the world. So redemption is how God saves the world, but then it becomes the pattern for how we go out into the world as those redeemed. We now go out not to redeem anyone in the salvation sense, but to act redemptively in the midst of exploitation, in the imitation of Christ and as members of his body. So there's no confusion in our minds between what Christ has done and what any Christian will do. And by the way, I would say, we at Praxis and I personally, we don't talk about redeeming the culture or redeeming business, those kind of things. No, it's just acting redemptively. Leave the redeeming and the ultimate fruit of our work up to God. Don't take on too much responsibility in a way. And yet there are redemptive actions available to us if we follow this pattern of creative restoration through sacrifice.
Yeah, helpful. That's helpful to get a picture of that and what our role is in that process. A comment and a question from one of our listeners this morning. They said, wow, I've never heard the story of Ruth told that way. Thank you for that. Here's the question. Why do you think the redemptive action isn't taught or spoken of in the pulpit more and in the Christian world as a whole?
Oh my goodness. What a good question, right? Because why haven't we taught the book of Ruth this way? I think you're right that many people have never heard this story, have never paused in this story to dwell on it and think about really the pattern it gives. And why is it so rare that we talk about this? Well, first of all, I honestly think a lot of effort and attention has been expended on the ethical, because the ethical is a real achievement to especially in the face of exploitation, to nonetheless do the right thing. This is not a small thing, and it's not wrong to instruct our children and in a way instruct one another in the way of doing what's right. So sometimes the church has become a kind of an agent of society in just articulating and equipping people just to do the right thing, to be good people, and we've let our obligations stop there. I think another reason is a kind of soteriology that is detached from our mission in the world. So a kind of missionless soteriology in which we do talk about redemption. I would guess that our friend who's commented has heard about redemption in the sense of what Jesus did for us, this idea of paying our debt so that we're now free from slavery to sin. That part we've taught. But we haven't connected the dots in a way to what then our life in the world might look like and how that empowers us to live sacrificially and restoratively and creatively in the world. So we need to change how we teach, because this unlocks possibilities for action for people. The moment you step out of your door, or honestly, even before you do, because our own families have histories of exploitation and have situations where just being good isn't enough. Like, this gives us a template for how we act when we step out into the world.
One thing that seems to be resonating in my mind through the 23 plus hours now of this event, and tied to just what you've been sharing during your time, Andy, is the need for the church to be more engaged in connecting the work of mission, the work of redemption into the concept of work. I mean, most people, even around the world, start working in their teens, and they work most of their lives in some way.
Yes.
And it seems like the church rarely, if ever, Bible studies, etc., rarely ever touch on these aspects of work. You know, we talk about living our faith out, but we never seem to connect it to work. It always is like, you know, when you go to the soccer game, when you're at dinner, when you're doing this or that, but it seems like it never quite makes the attachment to work. And yet every single person almost in our congregations, in our Bible studies, in our small groups, they are people who have been working since they were teens and probably will work in some form or fashion most of their lives. What a critical message, I think, at least one that has come through from the global forum these days, is that need for each one of us in our own lives to be engaging in that way. And then for the church and for Bible studies and small groups to be engaging in that way. Your thoughts on that?
Oh man, you're so right. And it's partly because, I mean, I would say most human beings will spend the single largest amount of waking hours they will spend will probably be in a work context. So if we don't have a really robust idea of what it is to be Christian there and to be redemptive there, I would say we're missing out on the bulk of our lives, as you say. I would also say, I mean, the honest reality is that the workplace is in many contexts, along I would say with the nation and the kind of the apparatus or the activity of the state and the way that laws are made and the ways that societies are governed. This is the place where exploitation can be the fiercest. So more people are exploited for economic reasons today than any other reason. So this is where exploitation has its like claws in human beings the most. It is the place where the most damage is done and amplified, especially modern economies, which are able to despoil whole communities and whole parts of creation with such efficiency. It's the place where ethics matters the most in a way, because if you can establish an ethical baseline, that's really good for people. But it's also the place where redemptive action is in some ways most creative and most unexpected. I will tell you, I won't say exactly where I was just to preserve the off the record nature of the conversation, but I was at a secular business environment just yesterday, and I shared this framework with them, and their jaws dropped and they kind of shrank back a little bit. Their jaws dropped with amazement because I shared some stories of how some of our praxis fellows and ventures are actually trying to live this out. And you could tell they were attracted to it, but you could also tell they were counting the cost for themselves and for people like them. But man, when you can step into the world of work and operate sacrificially, restoratively, creatively, that is a witness. It's one of the problems with kind of business as mission. I understand why business as mission is important, if only as a way to get those who know Christ into settings where there's no other way for Christ to be proclaimed or the story to be told. But we shouldn't just be telling the story. We should actually be living the story the way Boaz did, right? Living ethically every day, like he's got gleaning in his field. He protects the vulnerable in his field every day. But then when the right moments comes along, he realizes, oh, now I can be far more than ethical. And wouldn't it be amazing if Christians everywhere were known in their workplaces as the one who, when there's real pain, we see it and we step forward sacrificially and creatively find a better way.
Final question for you from one of our viewers this morning, or this afternoon or this evening, wherever they're watching around the world. They asked, how can we learn more about this redemptive action through sacrifice? And maybe have you written on it, or are there a website or your organization? How best can we get a hold of you and this information that might help somebody begin to take this into their community?
Yeah. Maybe the thing I'd recommend first is actually a brief series of podcasts that we did a couple years ago called The Redemptive Edge, where I interviewed 7 or 8 people who have lived this out, mostly in the US context, in very different places and and businesses and ways, but have done it in their work lives and in their calling. And each of them has an incredible story, as you'll hear. So the Redemptive Edge podcast is actual stories of some of our heroes who live this way. They're all ages, from 80 years old to 30 years old. Not all ages, but you have to be old enough to have a story to tell. And then praxislabs.org is our website for Praxis. It's the word praxis, the Greek word praxis, which means, faith in action, and then labs, like a laboratory, LABS, praxislabs.org. You actually can learn quite a bit more about how we call this the redemptive frame, which I just presented. You'll see a more entrepreneurship focused version of it there. And you'll also see quite a few more resources, including what we call the redemptive nonprofit playbook, which is how do you actually bring these principles into nonprofit organizations, the redemptive business playbook, where we talk about how it plays out in for-profit enterprises. Soon we'll have a redemptive investing playbook for people who are actually placing capital, and a redemptive philanthropy playbook. So how do you invest and give in ways that are redemptive? So gradually, as we learn from our community and see it lived out and learn from others who we invite into our community, we're trying to put it into words and into pictures and into stories, and praxislabs.org has a lot of that.
We'll make sure and connect people to that, the Redemptive Edge podcast and praxislabs.org. If you'll give me 1 more minute, we had one more question come in there just at the last moment,
Great.
and I'll give you a chance to answer this, and then we'll need to wrap it up. We've got a great guest from the Chicago area coming up next.
Yes.
One of our viewers said, in certain Christian cultures, the idea of social justice is balked at, but this idea of redemptive actions through sacrifice sounds like the ultimate in a social justice movement. How do you reconcile that with these various circles of Christianity?
Oh, man. In just a minute or two. Well, this is a very unfortunate development, I would say, in the last 100 years, is that Christians who, especially evangelicals, the first evangelicals, the first ones who called themselves that, were the 19th century followers of Christ, in many different church traditions, but part of this incredible renewal, among them Wilberforce's circle in England, and so many in America. And they intrinsically knew and lived out the idea that if the gospel were to be truly true for all human beings, that meant building all kinds of new capacity to care for the vulnerable. They basically invented philanthropy. They invented the modern nonprofit, the charitable nonprofit. And at the turn of the 20th century, there was a split in that movement, and the modernists won and the fundamentalists lost. And one of the things the fundamentalists took away was a deep suspicion of the word, of anything social. And this was a terrible development on all fronts. And I will say that when you hear the word social justice today, they don't always actually mean redemptive action. They sometimes mean a kind of government-led intervention that proceeds from very different premises from the biblical understanding of redemption. So we shouldn't be uncritically positive about any phrase that becomes sort of common, even redemptive action maybe. But this story of entering into brokenness, of acting in ways that ultimately restore whole systems, not just because it's not just one, the whole point of why Ruth is in there is that the systems are broken. These two individuals act redemptively, but then through their lives, a new systemic possibility is created that leads to the kingship of David, that leads to a new kind of rule in Israel. It's not like the judges, and it's not like the worst of the kings of the ancient world. It's a new kind of king because of his great-grandparents. So it has systemic effect. So I understand perhaps why there's a little hesitation to just embrace the phrase social justice with all the assumptions that might be behind it. But my goodness, this vision of restoring what's been lost in every segment and sector and at every scale, this is the Christian call. And the evangelicals of the 19th century saw it as their life work. And we need to see it as our life work as well.
Yeah. Well, the church was at the heart of it at that time. The church was leading it, and it's like we ceded it to government. No, you take it now. And it's probably time the church take back those things that we should have been doing all along and caring for in a redemptive way the people around us, the communities around us. That really is where we have an opportunity to make a difference. And I think to give people a different view of the church than maybe they have in the more political realms. Andy,
Exactly.
such a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for your presentation. Again, we'll point people to the Redemptive Edge podcast and praxislabs.org. Appreciate your contribution to our community, to society, and most importantly, this day to the Global Church Forum. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, everyone. So great to be with you.